Good morning. Welcome to Project Zero, 5 days of making 0 days hard in Southeast CDF with Ben Hawks. Before we begin, I have a few brief notes. Stop by the business hall located in Mandalay Bay, Oceanside, and Shoreline ballrooms on level 2 during the day and for the welcome reception at 5:30 tonight. The Blackhead Arsenal is in the business hall on level 2. Lunch will be served in Bayside AB from 1 p.m. until 2:30 p.m. And don't forget the merchandise store on level 2. Thank you for putting your phones on vibrate. It makes it easier for the rest of us to ignore the ringing. Ben, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, that's cool. Great slide there, right? Do I need to log into my machine? This is what you get for using a Linux desktop in 2019. How's that? There we are. My name is Ben Hawks, and I'm the team lead for Google Project Zero. And it's great to be back on the Black Hat stage. The last time I spoke at Black Hat was in 2008, and I was talking about attacking the Windows Vista heap. And a lot's changed since then. We still have heap exploits, unfortunately. But now we also have Google Project Zero. And this is a presentation called Project Zero, 5 years of Make 0 Day Hard. And indeed, we're celebrating the 5th anniversary of the public announcement of Project Zero. This is the Wired article that launched it all, featuring a great shot of our intern at the time, GeoHot, doing his best Zero Cool impression. Much respect. And so Project Zero is Google's applied security research team. It was created in 2014 by Chris Evans with a lot of help from Tavis Ormandy and many others in the Google security team. We've been discussing this problem of 0 day. So 0 day is a vulnerability or an exploit that an attacker knows about, but the defenders and the public does not know about. And we had a sense for many, many years leading up to 2014 that 0 day was an important problem for companies like Google, but also for society as a whole. We had seen sort of a shift, an increasing demand for 0 day, not for the purpose of defense, but for the purpose of offense. And we thought that we could do something about this and quickly coalesced around this mission, make 0 day hard. And within this statement, make 0 day hard, there's sort of an implied meaning that we believe that 0 day is too cheap and too numerous in proportion to the capability that it allows you. And capability, when we think of 0 day, we think of an attack that is very difficult to detect, that's highly reliable, and that works any affected target. There's no patch for this issue. So after 5 years, the obvious question to ask is 0 day hard yet? I suspect you might be able to guess the answer, but I'll leave you in suspense for some time before we can sort of build up a framework of what we're actually talking about here. So here's a brief outline of what we're going to talk about today. I want to start with some founding principles for Project Zero. These are 4 ideas that in our day-to-day life, we as a team refer back to time and time again when making decisions. And I wanted to start here with the principles. I've shared the mission, move on to principles to give you a sense of our team identity for what we're all about. And for each one, I'll sort of talk a little bit about what the principle is and then give you an example of how this manifests for Project Zero. Good defense requires a detailed knowledge of offense. This is a very well-known principle in security. It's where the idea of red teaming or pen testing comes from. And it manifests for Project Zero in the sense that we wanted to create a pipeline of work that resembles or mimics what a real attacker would do when creating a 0 day exploit. So we perform vulnerability research and exploit development in much the same fashion that a real attacker would want to and would like to pursue. We're really just adding one additional step to that pipeline of work, whereas instead of plugging the exploit into an implant, we tend to stop there, study the exploit, and then really reason about what is this exploit telling us about defense? What sort of long-term structural improvements could we derive from understanding this attack and this exploit? Moving on, attackers target the weakest link in the chain. Another classic principle, very familiar to this room. For us, this manifests in terms of target scope. So we had a lot of experience by performing product security reviews at a launch time basis. So when Google was creating products and services, they would go through a security review. And an innovation at Project Zero's is that we consciously detached from launch time product security reviews and really started to try to align our priorities with attacker interests and attacker priorities. So we wanted to be working on the same problems that an attacker was interested in. The logical conclusion of that is that we're not just going to look at Google software, but we're going to look at all software that both Google, our partners, and our users are relying on, whether that's Chrome or Android, of course, or other open source projects, or software from Apple or Microsoft or any other number of important vendors. Moving on. This is number 3. Openness benefits defenders more than it benefits attackers. And now we start to get into a concept or an idea that might be familiar to many of you, but is perhaps less universally accepted. This is something that we have arrived at after many years of experience doing security work, and something that we hold to be true in the vast majority of cases. It manifests for Project Zero in the sense that we really have a focus on transparency, that we want to share our results with as many people as possible, with the public, with vendors, and to get as much information about our work into the hands of as many people as possible. And we'll talk a little bit over the course of this presentation about some of the subtleties of why we think this leads to a better defensive output rather than arming attackers with some sort of sophisticated attacks, and how it's a net benefit. Challenging industry norms leads to improved security. And this really captures an essence of impatience or urgency. This concept that over the years, the security industry has built up a lot of assumptions and a lot of norms. And we think that it's healthy to respectfully challenge some of these assumptions for the modern age. The idea that many of the concepts or ideas that we've built up over the past few decades, some of them will hold true and stand up to scrutiny and remain with us for many years to come, but some of them are now outdated. And that we want to constantly strive towards models and decision-making frameworks that are in the best interest of user security based on the reality of how attackers are actually operating in the modern world. And so hopefully that gives you some sense of what our team is like from an identity perspective. I want to move on to what the day-to-day life of Project Zero is actually like. One day soon, we will get around to taking a team photo. Alas, until that happens, last year, Parisa at the Black Hat keynote used a group of kittens to describe Project Zero. I've gone for Cyber Matrix puppies this year. Stay tuned for next year. This is, roughly resembles the size of the team. It actually does feature Tavis's puppy Dexter, team mascot, and then the rest of the crew. And so when I think of Project Zero on a day-to-day basis, what sort of defines our team operation, the word autonomy comes to mind most oftenly. So we're kind of all bound together by the shared mission and these shared principles, but we're a very independent collection of security researchers, an alliance, a formation of independent researchers working in the same framework with the same principles and mission. And sort of a key innovation is that researchers have a very high degree of intellectual freedom within our team, the ability to pursue their own research agenda. We work in a model wherein we sort of meet on a yearly basis to define a broad overall scope for Project Zero. And then on a day-to-day basis, our individual researchers, we're really trusting them to choose projects that have high impact. And kind of as a research team, there is a fundamental sort of probabilistic nature of our work. We never quite know when we're going to have a positive result and find something really important. And so a high degree of flexibility means that we can constantly shift between projects that we think initially look promising and then perhaps have to pivot into new areas. And so we have, for example, OKRs, team-wide OKRs, but they're more of a sketch rather than a blueprint. And so individually, here are some of the sort of facets of work that you might find yourself working on as a researcher on Project Zero. I I think we're quite well known for the vulnerability research side of this work, but in practice there are many other sort of aspects to performing security research work at Google and within Project Zero. And I'll dive into sort of a few of these. I was told in no uncertain terms I'm not allowed to use any sort of management gimmicks, and yet somehow a word cloud appears in the presentation. I'm not quite sure how that happened. I just couldn't resist. And so sort of one of the first questions related to vulnerability research is, how do you, what do you work on? How do you choose what to work on? And this isn't a perfect science. Remember that we're trying to align with attacker priorities and to work on what they are also interested in working on. That tends to come from sort of different sources of information, leaks and private conversations we have with people in the private exploit market, analysis of zero-day exploits that get detected in the wild. And all of this gives us somewhat of a picture of what sort of targets that an attacker might be interested in. And I think above and beyond that, one of the most important facets of how we do target selection and try to stay in line with attacker priorities is using the experience and expertise of our team members to have predictive value, to really trust them. You might describe this as intuition or forecasting ability, but we work really hard to hire brilliant, talented people, and we want to lean on their expertise to make good decisions about what to work on. You can see here in practice it's very mobile heavy, very browser heavy, lots of sandbox escapes of that nature. That's a snapshot of what we looked at in the past 5 years, and naturally this will evolve over time. And so the next sort of question we often would get is in terms of how do you actually perform vulnerability research, the methodologies that we're using. Primarily, this is counted by number of bugs discovered. We have a label on our issue tracker that notes down which methodology is used most commonly. Primarily, manual review is by number the largest or most common methodology used. This is like source code review or reverse engineering a binary. And what this tells me is that if you're coming into the industry and you're in the industry and looking to pursue vulnerability research, building up that core skill set of being able to reason about code is still going to be a very important skill to have going forward. The next biggest bucket is fuzzing. It tends to be that Project Zero's contribution is more in terms of like bespoke artisanal fuzzing, as opposed to just sort of taking the known tools and running them on the known targets. And so a lot of that work is about surfacing new ways to think about mutation and generation, surfacing new ways to improve code coverage and so forth. And then our smallest bucket here at around 8.6% is other methodologies other than manual review and fuzzing, so things like static analysis or program analysis, advanced forms of binary instrumentation. You might even sort of put reading documentation into that bucket, I'm not sure. And this historically has been a smaller portion of the overall output. Now, one of the key words to refer back to is autonomy. There's no rules about which methodology to use when. It's very much an individual discretion of researchers. And it tends to be that individual researchers have a good sense of what types of methodologies work for them. It's a very personal decision. And so part of performing vulnerability research is thinking about what is the most effective methodology to use in any given circumstance, but also what new methodologies could we create that we haven't previously had access to. And so interspersing some design and software development work into a purely research-focused role is a very effective way to stave off burnout. And so we kind of skip between pure vulnerability research, operational research, and more traditional software development work. And this methodology building idea is one area where software engineering comes in. We are ultimately, however, an applied security research team, and so the efficiency of that methodology is really important to us. We want the methodology either to find bugs faster than we currently are at the moment with our existing methodologies, or to surface bugs that we couldn't otherwise surface. If it's doing one of those two things, it's probably quite interesting and we're going to pursue it further. If it's not hitting one of those buckets, it might still show potential, but it's probably not going to be highlighted in the graph that you saw previously as a significant factor. Okay, moving on. So remember we talked about a canonical pipeline of work where we perform vulnerability research to discover high impact vulnerabilities in the software that we all rely on. And then for some set of those vulnerabilities, we write exploits. And there's a number of different reasons why we would want to write an exploit. Sort of one of the traditional reasons is to demonstrate the security impact of the vulnerability, to make sure that that impact is well understood. And sort of related to that, abstracting that idea one step, is to say that with a fixed bug class and a fixed execution environment, if we write an exploit for that one instance within that class, it kind of sets up an equivalence where all other bugs in the same execution environment are going to be exploitable in the same manner. And that's really interesting and important when we have constantly changing execution environments as more mitigations are brought in and sandboxing is improved and so forth. So establishing a generic understanding of which issues are exploitable or not is always important. We've also noticed that, like, rationally, when you look at a vulnerability report, you can make an assessment that this is important and could be exploited, but emotionally, it's much harder to make that connection until you really see it live in action. And so creating that exploit, we've found, harnesses some sort of energy that we think results in kind of a closer to optimal response for that vulnerability. That's in terms of response from a vendor, certainly, or an open source project, but also in terms of fixing the issue, but also in terms of patch adoption. And then there's kind of like a couple of other facets which feed into the next part of our pipeline, which is that we want to study the exploits that we're creating to derive some sort of insights which we can use to further long-term structural improvements to software and hardware security. Exploit writing is a creative pursuit, and we're going to be creating new exploit techniques, and we can share those techniques with vendors in the world to start to think about how to counter these particular techniques. And indeed, by writing an exploit, you're really walking in the shoes of an attacker, and you face the same types of anxieties that an attacker does when trying to write an exploit. And there's an awful lot of luck involved in writing an exploit, and we get a sense from that process of writing an exploit of where we got a bit lucky, where the exploit is a bit fragile, and if things had been a little bit different in the environment, that the attack might not have worked out quite as well. And so these last 2 points give us an insight into ideas, concepts for structural change. Not just fixing an individual vulnerability, but advocating for change that really makes a step improvement in defensive posture and defensive security. Here are some ideas that we're sort of commonly thinking about when I use this word structural change, which will come up often in this presentation. Attack surface reduction, better sandboxing, exploit mitigations, fixing the bug class, so not just fixing an individual issue, but finding the root cause of why does that issue occur and then addressing the root cause. Process improvements, faster fixes, releases, and so forth, and improved documentation. Perhaps an API is hard to use, and if we just describe it better in the documentation, developers will be less likely to misuse it. And so we have many, many insights. Another one I would add here is also enabling the security research community to also do similar work that we're interested in, to build up a body of work from an initial starting point. A key kind of observation here is that Project Zero tends to be in a position to advocate for change rather than to actually implement it or to be the decision maker. There are a few exceptions, like we've done a lot of work, development work on Chrome and the Linux kernel, where we can be active participants and actually write the structural improvements ourselves. But for the most part, a lot of our job is about working out how to be good advocates for change, how to align with what a vendor or what an open source project wants to achieve anyway, and start to generate ideas that kind of match and with a high probability are going to be adopted. And so that gives you some sense of what the actual work that we do looks like. And I think now it makes sense to dive into some specific examples of the work that we've actually done over the past 5 years. Going back into the archives here, some of this might be familiar, some of it might be new. Here's the headline figures. Who would have known that you could have 100 million disclosure debates in 5 years, and yet somehow we managed to achieve it? We tend not to look at these numbers too much, though. it tends to be that counting the number of vulnerabilities that you're finding or something isn't really clearly representative of impact. There's a bigger story here. And so what I want to do is, this is going to explain a little bit the structure of how we're going to talk about these projects. On each slide, we're going to have a top half with kind of the result that we generated within our work and within our research. And on the bottom half, we're going to have the consequences of that work. So here's an obvious place to start. Spectre and Meltdown, a CPU security issue discovered in part by Jan Horn and many other researchers. It was a bug collision where multiple researchers reported the same issue around the same time. And this was, in essence, if you really want to understand the technical details, I'd go pursue Jan Horn's presentation at Real World Crypto. If we can think about what this issue represented, on paper, it's like an information leak across a security boundary, but in practice, it was kind of like a moment. It really had a shift, an industry-wide shift in thinking about how we approached and perceived CPU security and some of the assumptions that we had about how CPUs worked and what sort of guarantees they were providing. We had to go back and question them again. This led to substantial architectural changes across every level of the computing stack, browsers, hypervisors, kernels, etc. And we really saw like a marked redoubling of effort within the hardware industry to invest in security, to build up their security capabilities and improve their processes, improve their testing, etc. And so the cause was a discovery of a CPU security issue, and the effect was industry-wide. Moving on, if you follow along with iOS kernel security research, this was a very popular finding. It was a design flaw in the kernel that iOS and macOS uses, which led to privilege escalation. And essentially, what Ian Beer discovered was that every task pointer, it's a core kernel structure, was a potential security vulnerability. And this is kind of a unique response in the sense that it took multiple iterations working with Apple to fix this issue correctly, certainly, and it took well over our standard 90 days to address. But the end result wasn't just fixing a bug, but fixing the bug class itself. And so that has a much more pervasive effect than just fixing an individual vulnerability. Another example, Flash. So we performed a huge amount of vulnerability research on Flash, primarily driven by Natalie and Mateusz, lots of fuzzing, lots of manual review, and a huge number of vulnerability discoveries. And you might look at this huge number of vulnerabilities that we're finding and think, like, what's the point? There's just going to be 200 more after all of that. But it's what we coupled this vulnerability research work with that really matters. Well, I think fixing vulnerabilities has impact on of itself, but combined with this other sort of slightly more behind-the-scenes work, you really start to see the full picture. We collaborated with Adobe and Microsoft to implement exploit mitigations to make some of the standard exploit techniques more challenging. But aside from that, we were also pursuing James Forshaw on our team. He implemented an improved sandbox for Flash in Chrome, which at the time broke the canonical exploit chain. When we started Project Zero in 2014, a Flash exploit combined with a Windows kernel exploit was ubiquitous. We were seeing it time and time again. And what we managed to do is Project Zero, directly working alongside the Chrome security team, shipped an improvement to the Chrome sandbox, which broke the canonical exploit chain and forced attackers to pursue a new shape of an exploit. And again, working behind the scenes with Chrome and project managers in Chrome, we use the discussions generated by the huge volume of vulnerability research results to advocate for click-to-play for Flash and putting Flash on the path towards deprecation. I think those discussions were ongoing, certainly, but we helped to provide the data needed to usher that forward in a timely manner. On another example, kind of two different facets of Windows, MP Engine, which is Windows Defender's backend engine, and WPAD, which is proxy auto discovery. Again, we noticed that there was a higher level of complexity in these systems than you might expect. Well, at least Tavis did expect it, certainly. And we performed a degree of vulnerability research. We performed some exploit development. And what this has resulted in is sandboxes for both of these attack surfaces. So you start to see a common sort of pattern here, which leads to a side note. You may well have heard of some of that research. It tends to be that Project Zero's vulnerability research is a very popular, very well received, and has a high visibility. However, the structural improvements, the work that happens as a consequence of the vulnerability research, is generally not as visible to the security industry and the security community. And I just wanted to take a very brief moment to speak to the vendors and speak to the open source projects that are working with us on all of this very hard work on structural improvements to say, we see you and we recognize that work and want to say thank you for that. So here's one final example of a canonical shape of the vulnerability research, exploit development, structural improvements pipeline. Gal Benyamini performed an extended review of Broadcom, the ubiquitous Wi-Fi chipset, and he found many vulnerabilities. Then he wrote two different exploits, full chain exploits for Android and iOS. Essentially, if you're in the same Wi-Fi AP as a target, you can take over their device with these exploits. On Android, there was, if you're a connoisseur of exploit development, these are certainly very beautiful exploits. We're talking about exploiting the Wi-Fi chipset itself and then chaining another attack onto the actual CPU, the application processor of the mobile device. On Android, that was a very direct path because there was no IOMMU. There was no compartmentalization between the chipset and the main CPU. And on iOS, we had a similar shape of an attack. However, iOS had implemented Dart, which is an IOMMU-like system, and we managed to find sort of a configuration and implementation flaw to bypass the IOMMU. And so we released a 5-part blog series. We released some tools, and it was a very well-received research project. But things rumble on, and the effect happens over time. For Broadcom, certainly we noticed an improvement in their downstream communication, to telling their partners, the people who are using their chipset, that they had a vulnerability that was about to be fixed. That improved markedly. They invested in CERT processes, vulnerability response processes, and started pursuing some technical approaches as well, mitigations on the actual firmware running on the chipset. And for mobile vendors, I think it really, we had known conceptually that IOMMUs were an important part of compartmentalization, but this really provided the data that motivated, in the case of Android, motivated adoption of some basic IOMMU and configuration of the IOMMU. And for iOS, I think it led to certain implementation improvements to say that how it's configured matters. And for researchers, of course, we want to get this, the force multiplication effect of sharing our results with other public security researchers, and we love to see the work that they continue on after our publications. So this is a classically shaped project for us, vulnerability research, exploit development, very high profile, and then a set of structural improvements. And it's hard to count, really, to precisely know how many of these structural improvements are a consequence directly of Project Zero's work, because we, again, are generally in a position to advocate, conservatively at least 50. But what does this all mean? How do we put it in context? So we have this mission, make zero-day hard. The question is, how do we measure the hard in make zero-day hard? Perhaps every so often we hear about the price that an exploit is sold for in the gray market. If that's going up, maybe it's harder. Perhaps it's the number of vulnerabilities that we're finding. If we're finding less vulnerabilities, surely something's more secure. Or how many exploits have been detected in the wild? Well, it turns out none of these are satisfactory for a number of different reasons. The price of an exploit, it depends on demand as much as it does the actual cost of creating the exploit. The number of vulnerabilities, well, CVE counting has been debunked many, many times over as not being a good measure of how secure an application is. And detection, well, the rate of detection tells you nothing about the rate of non-detection. So what are we really measuring there? And so it turns out it's quite a, excuse the pun, hard problem to define the hard and make zero-day hard. This section is all about how many times I can say the word hard. We can make an attempt to find something better. None of these are quite as satisfying as we'd like either, but we start to at least talk about things that are perhaps more in line with things that an attacker really cares about. So I want to reframe a little bit the discussion, and instead of measuring what the state of a zero-day being hard means, step back one step and look at what does progress towards hard mean? Can we measure the progress towards that goal rather than the goal itself, the state of being in a world where 0 day is hard? And to me, this is how I've been thinking about progress towards hard recently, and I'm happy to share it just to generate debate and discussion. Perhaps not everyone will agree. For me, I think about it requiring two different facets. The first is, like, for any given fixed target, like we can take the Chrome browser, for example, to do a browser attack combined with a sandbox escape. We can repeat that same exploit year upon year upon year. In the case of Chrome, we have data going back to about 2011, year upon year upon year, and we can see where the plateaus in the cost and difficulty of creating that exploit are and where the upward slopes are over time. And from that, we have a good sense of what's the difference between creating the exploit in 2011 versus 2019, and how much is that increased cost for an attacker. But I don't think that's quite enough. If demand is increasing at such a rapid rate for these 0 day exploits, they could probably, attackers can swallow a certain amount of that extra cost and pass it on to customers. And I think kind of the additional factor that you need to consider is that across those step changes of one particular type of exploit becoming more difficult, does it lead to a shift in the metagame for attackers? Do they have to move on from a Chrome browser exploit to something else to change the shape of an exploit? A great example of this is, as we mentioned, in 2014, Flash plus the Windows kernel was standard, but we can't do Flash plus the Windows kernel anymore as attackers. It's not viable. We have to shift the metagame towards a renderer bug and an IPC bug or something of that nature. And so if we're shifting the metagame at a high rate, and if the time spent of building the equivalent exploit chain to an equivalent level of reliability, that's a key detail, is increasing, then we get a sense that we're progressing towards hard. Now, I've dodged the question somewhat, and you can think about the state of a 0 day being hard in a very abstract sense, in a non-measurable sense, I think. Perhaps hard is described in relative terms, that 0 day is hard when, given fixed operational requirements, the cost efficiency of using 0 day is less than other available methodologies, like 1 day or supply chain attacks or insider risk or something of that nature. Or perhaps you might think about hard 0 day being in absolute terms, that of the set globally of actors that want to maintain a 0 day exploit capability, only the top N% in terms of capability are actually able to do so. And for you, perhaps N% is 0, I don't know. But what seems clear to me, neither of these, again, I would find fully satisfying, but I like to put this out there for further discussion. What does seem clear to me from this, if the state of 0 day being hard resembles anything even remotely like this, then it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to precisely know the threshold point between 0 days not being hard to 0 days becoming hard. I suspect we will know eventually that we've entered the state of 0 day being hard. I think that's going to have artifacts and phenomenons that eventually we'll be able to figure it out. But the precise moment for any given target where we make this threshold is unlikely to be precisely known. Progress towards hard, I think, is measurable in a meaningful way. And so that is sort of a key place that we can always fall back to, is like, are we on the right trajectory and on the right path? So now we have somewhat of a framework to discuss the question, is 0 day hard? And I think the truth is it's harder, but not hard. And it would be wonderful if I could stand before you and describe the 5 years of Project Zero leading to this great accomplishment where we can, in subjective or objective or any sort of terms, describe 0 day as being hard. And I don't think we're there quite yet. We're looking at a piece of digital art from 1974. I like this because it, to me, evokes like an Ida graph view somewhat, by an artist called Vera Molnar. And she has a quote in which she says that paradoxically, machines, which are thought to be colder than human, enable the most subjective and profound in humans. And to me, this quote really says that the problem is worth working on, that these machines that Vera was talking about in 1974 have done so much for our users, for society, so much positive. And if we can have an impact on these machines being safe to use, then that's a good accomplishment. That's something that we can be proud of, and it's worth progressing towards and aiming for. And so it's a little bit of a pivot to optimism here. Whilst we haven't achieved what we have set out to achieve yet, and we're facing substantial challenges towards getting where we need to get, the problem is worth working on. And so I want to step back and abstract a little bit and talk about some lessons learned from the past 5 years. I'll start with kind of a core message or a core narrative, and I want to address precisely this challenge that I mentioned. And I want to describe it in sort of a slightly unusual way, which is I think there is a risk that the public state of the art, the public understanding of how attacks really work, diverges from how the private state of the art looks, how attackers are really implementing these exploits. And once that divergence occurs, it's going to be very difficult to counter it. I think this occurs primarily because the utility of information about an individual attack, the value for an attacker, seems to outweigh the value for a defender for any given individual vulnerability. And so the incentives to keep this information private, to not share it with Black Hat or the public security community, is high and increasing every year. However, I think that the Project Zero model, if you will, is a viable approach to staying in line with attacker understanding and attacker interests. I think this is a consequence of like the self-organizing effects of giving researchers a high amount of autonomy and freedom and asking them to align their interests with attacker interest and rewarding that. The story doesn't stop there, however. It's not just that Project Zero style work allows you to be in line with attacker interests. I really believe that we have enough insight and evidence about how this type of work is performed to say that what we might describe as open attack research in the Project Zero model provides the best path forward to this mission, make zero day hard. There's a lot to unpack there about why. There's something quite powerful in the realization that security researchers don't change vendor behavior insofar as users and customers change vendor behavior. And there's something really compelling and powerful about doing this work in a way that teaches users to ask the right questions and teaches users to ask for the right things. And so I see this as a compelling path forward, but I suspect that you all are not surprised that I would say that. So I'm going to blast through a couple of other, well, actually about 8 different ideas that are on my mind at the moment, what we might call the lightning round of random thoughts from Ben. And the first is a really key idea in security. It's this idea that security is unique because we have an adversary, and it's the adversary's job to deprive us of the data that we need. And in fact, it's their job to mislead us actively about what they're working on. And sort of the consequence of this is that if you're making decisions purely based on the data that's available to you about attacker behavior, by definition, that's going to be a suboptimal decision. And so the consequence of that is that you really need to model attacker behavior. The problem with that is that there's a really wide range of justifiable models for attacker behavior. There's so many unknowns here that it's a big challenge. A sort of follow-on effect of this is, unfortunately, I don't expect that we will ever settle or solve the vulnerability disclosure debate. Part of this idea of there being so many validly justifiable models means that there's also many validly justifiable vulnerability disclosure policies. And I find that often in disclosure debates, we tend to lose sight of this, that everybody is working in good faith towards the same result, but just working off of a different model. And so shifting that discussion as opposed to like flame wars and an emotional kind of talk of irresponsibility and so forth, and shifting it towards like a discussion of the data and a discussion of the models, I think is going to be very beneficial in the long run. Another sort of consequences of this idea that we have to model everything about attacker behavior is that there is a kind of a hazard I see in which organizations tend to choose the model, the first justifiable model that they come across that is in line with their business goals or business aims, or organizational aims, whatever that might be. And it's very challenging once this occurs, once this comfortable model sets in and you have sort of a way of seeing the world which is justifiable, but is tightly coupled to your broader aims as an organization. I find it very challenging to motivate people to iterate on their models, to move incrementally towards something that is better for user security and better for the accuracy of the decisions you make with the model. So this, I think, is a really big unsolved problem. Vulnerability triage. Speaking of vulnerability disclosure, we report a huge number of vulnerabilities, and the work of triaging and responding and fixing these vulnerabilities is incredibly undervalued. When done well, this can be hugely impactful work, taking the high quality reports from external researchers and really extracting as much value from that report as possible. However, if done poorly, it can be a systemic risk when we're thinking of, for example, a patch attempt that doesn't fix the vulnerability correctly, where the patch essentially signals where a vulnerability is and leads to variants that are later on discovered by attackers. And I think I see this as a somewhat urgent problem where we need to value this work more. We need to recognize it. Frankly, we need to promote these people. We need to pay them more. We need to empower them to make the changes that they need to make organizationally. We need to enable them to connect with external researchers and remove layers of bureaucracy from their role. There's a whole range of things that we need to change in this type of work. And I think we need to shift this type of role from being a stepping stone towards other projects and just something that we want to get through, and then we want to move on to our more interesting work and really make a pipeline of work around these external reports that extracts as much as we possibly can and leads to collaboration and all of this good stuff. I see this kind of across the board. There isn't any one vendor that's fallen into this trap in particular. It is a very common pattern. And so speaking of this idea that often there's a temptation just to get through the vulnerability triage queue and then move on to work that really matters, I think there's a tendency to think that we can engineer our way out of the problem with mitigations, with sandboxes, and with attack surface reduction alone. And I think this perhaps is now unpopular to say, but vulnerabilities do matter. Fixing individual vulnerabilities matter. In a world where we're just shipping exploit mitigations but not substantially improving the software security and the underlying security practices and development practices, we're always going to be able to find edge case vulnerabilities. The edge case vulnerabilities that still have desirable properties that allow us to bypass all of your best defenses. And so it's the combination of bug fixing and building all of these structural improvements that is most effective. A quick aside on bug collision, we've reported a lot of vulnerabilities, over 1,500, and I think doing this work publicly gives us a unique perspective on bug collision, a global perspective, if you will. Doing this work in a very high-profile manner unlocks private conversations about bug collision with real-world attackers. And this is a perspective that I think I would just want to point out that attackers themselves don't share. Attackers tend to think about bug collision in terms of their vulnerability findings colliding with a vendor fixing a particular set of vulnerabilities, the rate of their bugs being fixed. But really what you want to measure when thinking about bug collision is the rate of any individual attacker colliding with any other attacker globally. And so shifting perspectives, or realizing that we each have sort of blind spots in our understanding of bug collision, is going to be very important for a lot of policy discussions coming up. Opportunism is magic. I won't dwell on this too much, but this idea of having a high degree of flexibility has paid off time and time again for Project Zero. The idea that we don't always know what we're going to achieve when we set out, and that we kind of form a strategic plan as we're proceeding through a particular research project, that the results are tied then to a strategic plan, and that the results are occurring through this magic of a high amount of flexibility and autonomy in the team. And finally, a quick word on what we might call greatness. Not to sound too highfalutin, like all pursuits, like all types of work, I think there is a difference between good and great in security research. It's not clear exactly what that is. It's not just being super creative, because mechanical perfection is a type of greatness too. But we tend to know what we see it, know when we see it. And the key here, I believe, is that pursuing greatness requires taking risks. And people are only going to take risks if they feel safe to do so. And so this concept of rebounding from failure, from having a sort of a positive culture around negative results, is really, really important to give space to pursue greatness. And that really is a random grab bag of ideas that I've had on my mind in the past month or so. There's a lot to unpack there, a lot of intensity. In the last 5 minutes, I want to just work through the next 5 years of Project Zero. And it probably makes sense to start with what won't change. And this is the core, the pipeline of work, the canonical pipeline of work. I suspect that this will look fairly familiar in the next 5 years. There are certainly a few areas like mobile and browser security where I would expect we continue to make significant contributions and will be a focus. But also, I suspect that we will shift our scope over time in line with the attacker's interests shifting as well. And that's somewhat hard to predict. What's that going to look like? Is it this idea of like a hybrid insider risk using zero-day? Is it more server-side? Is it cloud? Is it hardware? It's hard to say. But keep an eye out. We're going to continue doing vulnerability research and exploit development work. I think, actually, just briefly before I move on, there are a couple of areas where I think we can sort of redouble our investment somewhat. Methodology building is a key area. I think we've learned that practitioner-driven methodology development, creating new approaches to find vulnerabilities, is very, very effective. And also in terms of the structural improvements, learning how to be good advocates for this change. Nobody's done this work in exactly this type of model before, and so we're kind of learning as we go along. I think what we know now is that we have to ratchet up the level of experimentation as a result to advocating for structural improvements, and we have to improve our operational rigor. We've been very good at like throwing great ideas across a fence, but not so good at the follow-up and really making that happen with discipline. And certainly there's lots of other great things that we have in the works. I'm really excited about bringing Maddie Stone onto the team to lead a zero-day analysis effort. Certainly we're talking to a lot of vendors about partnership. We've been in constant communication with vendors over the past 5 years, and they're often encouraging us to work very closely with them and really finding like what the trade-offs are and which approaches are more effective. Very tight partnership versus this purely independent research model and utilizing the power of open attack research. I think we really want to explore both sides of that equation. Stepping into policy discussions, certainly. I see a lot of important discussions and debate at the moment related to security research. And I think that as practitioners, we can have a role in terms of lifting the level of technical understanding in some of these discussions. Sharing our results to new audiences. Certainly we've done very good at speaking to other security researchers. There's lots more that we could do to speak to developers, enterprise users, etc. We have a lot of insights that go above and beyond really low-level exploit development details. Patch gap, certainly this is a problem around one day. It's on our mind. I won't dwell on it too much for purposes of time. And internally to the team, thinking about collaboration. We are sort of like this independent alliance of researchers working towards the same mission. And collaboration tends to happen very organically. There's a natural process of research agendas overlapping. And that works fairly well over time. But I think I've heard great things about what more structured collaboration can perform when done in a vulnerability research setting. For example, sitting down on literally the same monitor, performing manual review together. Ideas like this, I think I'm really excited to try out. So, to recap, I just want to dive in back to our core message, to this idea of the best path forward. And so, within this message, there's the sense that we want to encourage more open attack research, more researchers publishing full technical details about vulnerability research and exploit development, and then following that up and using that published work to motivate structural changes and long-term improvements to security. We want more of it. And so one way we can achieve that is obviously by growing Project Zero, and we're certainly planning to do that. But another sort of logical conclusion is that we can expand the amount of open attack research by having more Project Zeros. And this is an idea, a concept that we certainly have talked about as a team for many, many years. It was always sort of like an implicit hope that we had, that we could motivate the creation of more teams like Project Zero, but we never had an explicit goal. In my sense, there's a lot of work in the industry happening already that is very close to Project Zero style work. And I really would encourage people to forget about vulnerability disclosure for a moment and instead try to focus in on the mission and the principles, and sort of within that finding areas of commonality, finding areas where we are seeing eye to eye and things are in line. Vulnerability disclosure, if nothing in this conversation, is a bit of a distraction. We can agree to disagree on a lot of the vulnerability disclosure details. But focusing on that common mission and common principles, when I talk to people throughout the security industry, whether that's an industry or other areas, other organizations, I do see a lot of reason for optimism. That there are a lot of shared principles and there are a lot of shared approaches to this mission. And so I think I can set out at least a new personal goal. There would be a wonderful outcome in 5 years' time to be on the stage talking about a coalition of Project Zeros. And in the interest of making it not too wishy-washy, here's one possible sketch for how that might work in practice. It's incredibly lightweight. It doesn't need to be difficult. A website, somewhere to organize and aggregate the security research results, where instead of having Twitter as like the primary broadcast medium, that we have somewhere where we can categorize all of the amazing attack research work that's happening in kind of a sensible and organized fashion. A mailing list to sort of unlock this, the spirit of IRC, to sort of, not as a vulnerability sharing club, but as a place to have lightweight collaboration and a place to have technical discussions together. And of course, some sort of meeting, a simple summit to discuss attacker trends and attacker behavior. It really shouldn't be too difficult. I think it really comes down to thinking about the core principles, the core mission that we have in common. So if you are on an attack research team of this nature, or would like to be, or are planning to create one in the future, one call to action I have at the very end of this presentation is, please come find us and let's talk about a coalition of open attack research. It's been an absolute pleasure. I want to say thank you to all of the people I work with at Project Zero. It's been a fabulous 5 years, the best 5 years of my career. And I'm really, really excited and looking forward to the next 5 years. And also, thank you all in the audience for listening to my presentation.